And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them. Yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
As always, thanks for tuning into the podcast. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm the director of TeachThought PD. Okay, a couple logistics and housekeeping items. As I mentioned in the last episode, we have pre-registration open for next summer's Grow 20 event. But now we actually also have another event that I'm excited to announce. We will be having an open registration Foundations of PBL workshop in Hilton Head this spring. The dates for that will be March 16th through 18th. We'll have Monday, Tuesday, and be done at 11:30 on the Wednesday. So hopefully, if you are looking for a place to get away from winter weather, perhaps, and relax, we will be at a resort on Hilton Head Island, the Beach House, a Holiday Inn resort, and we will get to work, and hopefully in the evenings the weather will be good and you can sit by the beach and take a walk on the beach and connect with educators from around the world and build your capacity and understanding of project-based learning. So if you want more information on that, I encourage you to go to wegrowteachers.com/PBLHH. You can also look under the events tab. And as I mentioned, Grow 20 pre-registration is open. We'll probably open regular registration in January or so, and that will be in June of 2020, our 4th annual PBL Grow event. As always, I encourage you to share and tell others about the podcast and our work and any blogs or content that we have. We appreciate it, and as usual, we hope it's helpful. In this podcast episode, I spoke with Dan Cogan and Matt Gross of Newsela. If you're not familiar with Newsela.com, they are a platform that helps schools and teachers deliver content that is at a reading level appropriate for different levels of readers and students. Newsela is a resource that we have recommended in our workshops for differentiation purposes, but this conversation centered around the topic of bias and how we navigate that in our news sources and perhaps other sources with our students. So we touched, of course, on the bias in news sources and how they pick their news sources and how they pick what they are going to publish as content, what they do to help teachers build critical thinking skills to navigate different spin on sources, as well as the idea of confirmation bias and how they translate text to those different reading levels, that process. Definitely an interesting conversation because it is certainly a skill that our students and many adults need to develop as they navigate the world of post-truth America and different bias in news sources. I will apologize in advance. I lost track of the time and they had a hard stop time, so we had a bit of an abrupt ending. But the links and things that we talked about will be in the show notes, and maybe we can connect at another time to finish the conversation. Hope you find it helpful. All right, welcome Dan and Matt. I'm going to give them an opportunity to introduce themselves, as I usually like to do, but they are here from New York City, right? And
That's
with
right, yep.
Newsela, which I always thought was newsela.com, but Newsela. And we're going to talk about their work and navigating sources and bias and news and other sources as teachers and schools think about navigating that in our current environment. But Dan and Matt, why don't you go ahead and give a brief introduction of yourselves?
Sure. I'm Matt Gross. I'm founder and CEO.
I'm Dan Cogan Drew, co-founder and chief academic officer.
Okay, and how did you guys start this and get into this work?
Yeah, well, I'll give my side of the story, and then Dan can share his perspective. So So I've been in education for a long time. My first job in high school was working for a curriculum company. I was a teacher in the South Bronx. It was my first job out of college. I worked in New York State on implementing some education reforms, including Common Core standards and new system for virtual learning, things like that. And it was really my experiences at working at the state where I realized that teachers were looking for a change in their content. They felt like content could be far more relevant, far more meaningful to their students, far more flexible, far more up to date, and meet kids where they are. And the big education publishers at the time, much to our frustration, they were just not responding in the way that we had hoped. And I created a website, co-created a website at the state called Engage New York, which was designed to help teachers directly. When that really became a hit, that was a big aha moment for me, that if we can create a website with high quality content that gives teachers everything that they need all the content that they need to construct great lessons for their kids, engage kids, have them see themselves in the content and meet them where they are, and take them where they want to go, then we can really be doing a great service to education. And so I met up with Dan, who was working at a school network at a time and had been a longtime thought leader in digital learning, and pitched him the idea at a cafe in Bushwick, Brooklyn, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Okay, Dan, what's your story?
Yeah, my story is a little different. I spent most of my professional career in classrooms in one way or another. I started out as a teacher in a number of different settings, and then started working at university in teacher education. Worked for a regional educational service center doing STEM work with high school students around the state of Connecticut, and then I was working at Charter School Network before when Matt approached me. I think I got into this sort of as a means to an end. My job at the time when Matt and I spoke was to help select digital learning products for 20 some odd schools in Connecticut and New York at the time, and I saw a lot of really promising technologies evolving in the hardware space with Chromebooks. This is like circa 2010, 2011. There was some interesting learning models, call it personalized learning and flipped classrooms that had a lot of promise. But then in the software space, across the different subject areas, there's pretty uneven quality of products in terms of what teachers and students really needed. So what I saw were some good products in like world language acquisition, some good products in math, but after you sort of got through the so-called learning to read ages, like K-2, when you got into reading to learn, which was really for the schools I was working with the most important priority, the software options just weren't really getting it done. I was in a position of sort of recommending things that I felt only sort of half-heartedly supportive of. So it felt like there was a big gap between students and teachers' use of technology outside of the classroom as consumers, and then they sort of checked their expectations at the door and sort of held their noses and used the products that the schools had to use, whatever was available. So it's in talking to colleagues around the country in roles similar to my own, I was hearing very similar things. So it felt like there was a need and a gap. And when Matt approached me, like news and literacy wasn't the first time anyone's put those two things together, but it felt like we had an opportunity to so-called raise the bar and meet students and teachers with at their higher level of expectation as wanting like a consumer grade experience with content that was authentic, but could be made accessible, assessments that would give some visibility to teachers and students as to what they were reading and understanding. So that's what really compelled me. Pretty much from the moment Matt presented the idea to me, I couldn't stop thinking about it.
Right. And then, so how did you come up with the name? Because like I said, I've always thought of it as Newsela because you put news and then English language arts together, and maybe that's it. But but it's Newsela. So how did that name come to fruition?
Yeah, I mean, well, you kind of got me there because it really did come from news and ELA.
Okay.
Even though news is only a piece of what we do now, and ELA is only a piece of what we do now. We liked the name at the time. I've got my Jewish roots, and Newsela kind of it sounded like Bubala, so that appealed to me too. And the name seemed to really resonate with teachers. At the beginning, when we first launched, we were really just targeting Newsela at middle school ELA teachers, and especially at the sort of height of Common Core implementation, it really did resonate. But we sort of outgrown that, but we stuck with the name as it seems to be a name that a lot of teachers like.
Right. So I have recommended Newsela. I'm going to have to train myself and break myself in workshops and in work with teachers and schools in our work, because I think it's a great tool for differentiation, which is one of the things that we work with schools on. But I guess, can you condense in a nutshell, what's your elevator pitch for exactly what Newsela does?
Sure. So I think what Newsela does so well is that differentiation piece, that it brings an authentic learning experience within reach of every student in the classroom.
Okay.
If we're going to the third floor, that's what I would say.
Okay.
If we're going to the 18th floor, I might add that it allows every student to participate, and it gives them their own access to learning, and it gives their teachers visibility into students' understanding, and it works alongside the teacher but does not replace them.
One thing that we're really proud of is giving teachers, first of all, software that's dead simple to use. There's for a long time in education, software was given short shrift and always felt like it was a decade behind software that you used in your everyday lives. You open up Spotify or Snapchat or all the software that makes your life good, arguably. And then you opened up your education software. It was just a totally different experience. Dan and I promised each other that our bar for education software was going to be the best consumer grade software in the market, and fortunately, education does seem to be catching up, and I was happy to be a part of that. And teachers also appreciate Newsela because it gives them pretty much all the content that they need to build their lessons of study and their units of study and their lesson plans, and having that sort of one-stop shop. But one-stop shop that in the old model is one voice, one perspective, one way of learning. And variety has been crucial to our success. It's a variety of topics, a variety of perspectives, a variety of learning strategies that it can support, as well as a variety of levels to deal with your differentiated readers. So teachers are different, students are different, they need different materials at different times, and they need to be responsive in real time to the conditions of the class. And the only way that you could do that is by having a responsive body of content that provides a ton of variety.
Right. Well, it certainly is a useful tool, and I don't know how many teachers and schools are using it, but my perception is that there are lots of schools and teachers using it. And one of the things that you all engage in, as you mentioned, it's maybe not the bulk of the work now, but certainly used to be, and it is at least a significant part, is engaging with news, which we all... I don't think anybody would argue the fact that news is struggling to, let's say, provide unbiased accounts of the news, and what our social media and our online habits and the incentives of getting clicks and ads and revenue that way, I think has driven the news to be less factual and more maybe sensational and biased in one way or the other. So in that context, how do you all navigate, what do you do to navigate that kind of landscape? You have lots of different sources, and I don't know how you feel about those sources, if you feel some of them or none of them have bias, but how do you navigate that?
Yeah, it's a great question. We have 2 million teachers and over 25 million students registered on a platform. Newsela was used in some form or another in about 90% of all schools last year. So, it pretty quickly got to the point where, I mean, we always took our content selections very, very seriously, and it's even more serious considering what our footprint is. So it's something that we think about all the time. The bottom line is the way that we've approached content is, number one, pick from high quality sources where the information that they're presenting is factual. So any writer, when they write anything, is going to, it introduces a perspective, once they've decided to focus on a topic or a story. And that's somewhat unavoidable, but one of the things that we can do is criteria number 2 is to provide variety, a variety of perspectives, a wide variety of stories. And so when we look at, so again, it's not just news, but it's our biographies, it's historical documents, primary source documents, and so on and so on and so on. What we're trying to do is provide a wide variety of perspectives, and that does a couple of things. So one is that it's just important for learning. Building background knowledge is crucial in every subject, and there's increasing evidence about the importance of building background knowledge. So providing variety helps do that. But there's also increasing research that says when students see themselves and their lived experiences in the content that they're consuming in class, they tend to feel more included in class, and the psychological safety is there, and they tend to learn more because they're more interested. So we love providing perspectives on veterans, on people in urban communities, in rural communities, on disabled students, on girls who do ballet and girls who play football, on boys who do ballet and boys who play football. And when students can see themselves in their content, it's incredibly powerful. And so that's one of the other ways that we choose our content. And also in the variety of perspectives, sometimes we'll be very, very explicit about getting kids to think about alternate perspectives. So we have a series of articles called Pro Cons, where it's two different opinion pieces on two different sides of the same issue. Like there was one where Notre Dame was covering up paintings of Christopher Columbus. And really great story around Columbus Day. It's a controversial topic, and there's a pro piece and a con piece on the decision to cover up those paintings. So being both implicit and explicit in students absorbing those perspectives so that they could talk about them in class and understand the lived experience and perspectives of others is something that's really important to us.
Yeah. So there's different ways in which to present multiple perspectives, and that could be the topic, that could be the content that is in there, the variety of the topics. But so I'm wondering how one of the things that started this conversation or spurred this conversation was a tweet that I saw from a former colleague of mine when I was with the Buck Institute. That was Jim Bentley, and what he was upset about was commonsensemedia.org, which I think is a pretty helpful site in general. I would assume perhaps that it's either used or produced by folks who might be a bit more right-leaning. I don't know that, just sort of my hunch, but I very well could be wrong about that. But there was a series of reviews there from parents, and if you're not familiar with that site, folks, you'll see parents say and kids say, and there's ratings and there's narrative, and there are series of and several responses and reviews from parents about Newsela that is saying that Newsela is very biased, that it's left wing, that it's propaganda, all of those things that you would think people in that sort of sphere might think about, or the way that they might talk about things. And I'm wondering how you feel about that, and have you got any opposite reaction in other places?
Yeah. So first of all, on Common Sense Media, I don't share the perspective that there's some sort of right-leaning bent to them. I actually think Common Sense Media is a fantastic resource.
I do as well.
For teachers and parents, and provide a pretty open forum for people to talk about things. Now, one of the things that we do see is that we do get comments from parents, especially from time to time. It's not frequent, I will say, but we do get some, and parents are rightly looking out for their kids and want to make sure that they're being provided with high quality educational content, and that's a very fair perspective. Unfortunately, in these polarized times that we live in, sometimes the extreme voices and suspicion of the media has caused people, to sort of take to the streets and make some comments that, in many cases, are not accurate, and in some cases really just reflect their own perspectives. So there's not a ton that we can do about the times that we live in, but so we tend not to respond. Too directly to the questions about bias, other than by saying, here are our standards, here are our content selection criteria, and it's really up to teachers and parents to take it or leave it. The other thing I will say is that we do give our teachers and our school districts full power to edit out the materials on Newsela that their students are exposed to. There's very clearly there on every single one of our articles, there's a hide button there. So we give teachers and districts choice about what they expose to their students. In the end, we can make certain curation decisions, but it's ultimately up to the teachers to decide what's best for their students.
And have you received similar, accusations from people on left-leaning, maybe sites or maybe in person, or I don't know where it would be necessarily, saying that you're presenting right-leaning sources?
Yeah, we've absolutely gotten comments from. I don't want to characterize it as left-leaning because I can't speak to the politics of those individuals, but on certain perspectives on Israel, or certain perspectives on Black and Latino students, we've definitely gotten comments about how we cover those issues that I think from an outsider could be perceived as a left-leaning voice. But again, we just keep on going back to, listen, these are our standards for how we select content sources and how we pick our content. We want to provide content from vetted high quality sources, and provide a wide variety of perspectives for our students.
Right. So there's a list of sources that you pick from that folks could make some judgment or accusation on, and then there's content that you select from those sources that they could potentially make those problem accusations as well. And I can imagine it's just got to be really hard. I don't know if you're familiar with, there was an organization, and I think there have been several, who have tried to present a truly facts-only approach. One of them that tried and went out of business was the Knife Media, and I think there's some other ones. I tend to look in a lot of news sources, one of them being Spectrum. I don't know if you're familiar with Spectrum. It is SPECTRYM. I'll link to it in the show notes. That I think does an interesting job. I don't know how great it is or at least they have, looking at it here, they have like top stories. So climate change, and they have something from Reuters, they have BBC, CNN, Fox News, and they list them as left articles or right articles. So they're transparent in what those articles are. So that's another different way to go about it. And I guess, is there any sort of bias detector or anything like that you use when you pick the sources and or use the pick the sources and then the content that you choose to include on Newsela?
Well, in terms of the sources, again, like we go back to the sources with journalistic standards that we believe meet our high journalistic standards as well. In terms of the bias of the individual articles, that's really difficult to detect, and will almost entirely depend on the perspective of the reader. And the way that we address it is just by providing a wide variety of perspectives across the spectrum, as well as a wide variety of sources. So we have well over 100 sources of content on Newsela, ranging from NASA to the Kansas City Star to the White House Historical Society. When you think about news publications, we'll have the Associated Press on there. And there's publications where the editorial boards are clearly have a left-leaning political bent. Like the Washington Post, we don't publish opinion pieces from the Washington Post unless we do have an alternate perspective as well. But then we'll have the Christian Science Monitor in there as well, and that has a more right-leaning editorial board. But what we like about those publications is both of their journalistic standards are very, very high. They check their facts, they check their sources. If the Wall Street Journal, ultimately there's an opportunity to partner with them, we would absolutely love to. They're a very high quality publication, and their editorial board is certainly very right leaning. So that's generally how we tackle it. We're really proud of how we have provided a wide variety of perspectives and different lived experiences. How we've covered the most important news topics that are being talked about today. One of the reasons I started Newsela in the first place, like I frequently talked about my son Curtis, who was a struggling reader. I rarely talk about my son Calvin, who was actually a very advanced reader, but when back in elementary school, he was being given news articles, and it was just fluff. Articles on water skiing squirrels and the baby panda being born at the zoo. And it's nice to mix those in, but one of the things that we recognize about kids is in this media saturated day and age, kids can take on some really challenging topics, can think deeply, and that's good for society. So we pull no punches in the content that we provide for students. That makes our jobs tougher because we need to provide a wide variety of perspectives on those tough topics. And I got to say, I'm really proud of the job that our editorial team has done in achieving that.
Right. Yeah, it's got to be a real challenge, and I'm all for. And anybody who has listened to me or seen any of my work or things I talk about on social media or things is the importance of our students, K-12 and university, any level, really being able to age appropriately engage in topics and questions that are sometimes controversial. Some people would say, "Oh, we shouldn't be talking about that," or those things. I mean, even climate change, which is being sensationalized, and there are differing opinions on how dire this is. But I mean, everything from that to gender and race and all of those things, we have to be able to talk about them. And it seems like the way to go about this that actually helps us make progress is, like you said, to provide multiple sources and really engage in deep questioning and deep inquiry around things that may or may not make you uncomfortable. So are there things that Newsela does that other than just the sources that help teachers do that kind of thing? Because that's the job of a really great teacher, right? Is you have this tool, but as you mentioned, they have the autonomy to use it in a way that helps build those thinking skills. But is there something that Newsela does that helps them do that?
Yeah, so we've actually done a bunch of things on media literacy, on understanding a variety of perspectives, and so on. One of the best was our Mile in Their Shoes campaign, where we partnered up with a couple of nonprofit partners who were focused on building empathy for different perspectives and also media literacy and identifying fake news and things like that. And teachers really appreciated it at the time, and this was sort of the fever pitch of the post-election talk about fake news and bias in the media and so on. And also, it was in sort of the height of Americans seeming to vilify others based on their perspectives, and we said, well, we don't have a particular dog in either hunt other than to say students who understand each other's perspectives and can separate fact from fiction are going to be better contributors to society, and they're probably going to learn more effectively in school. Mm-hmm. So that was a great program that we ran. We still do provide a bunch of media literacy resources, lessons that focus on lesson plans that focus on media literacy tied to our articles. It's something that's important to us, though. I will say that we don't consider ourselves first and foremost a media literacy organization. There's other great organizations that focus on that, and we're happy to support their work. What we are is a content platform that's providing all the content that schools need to build quality lessons.
Right. Well, one of the things that is essentially impossible to avoid is confirmation bias. I think that's just something that, to whatever degree, people are going to have, and research shows that we can't overcome that. We can correct for it somewhat, but we can't completely overcome it. And so I wonder if you have any sense of how teachers and how well teachers are able to do that, and parents are able to do that, and students are able to do that. And if you have any experience in that, I mean, if we look at, for example, the New York Times, and I agree with you. I think New York Times is for the most part, the journalistic standards are very good. As with the Wall Street Journal, as with other major news outlets, there are occasions when they fall short, and there are things in all of those publications that I think they do because it does sort of confirm, it feeds into the confirmation bias. So one recently I'd seen was around it was a graphic that they showed around the amount of water or amount of land, I think it was in Vietnam, that was going to be challenged by rising tides, and that was accurate. But what they didn't show was that much of the land that they showed, which was in red, which very attention getting, was already adapting to high tides and higher tides because they are a low land. So it was I felt like it was a little misleading in a way that probably generated more clicks, and people who are really determinedly interested in climate change and that are super passionate about that's something that they're going to click on. And so I'm wondering if you, again, come back to my question, if you've seen any particular tips and tools, or do you feel like adults or kids have any better way to navigate that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I was about to say I totally agree with you on confirmation bias, but then I realized maybe that's my own confirmation bias that's having me agree with you. So, I think it's a serious issue. And first of all, like what I'd say about the sensationalistic articles, and you're 100% right that every publication is, I would say virtually every publication, if not every publication, is prone to that from time to time. Mm-hmm. And I think our editorial team has been pretty good at steering away from articles, even from quality sources that veer into the sensationalistic. Like in terms of advice that I would give to teachers and students, it is to say always question the author's intent. Always question what other perspectives might be. When statistics are presented, might there be alternate statistics and facts that would provide a countervailing argument, and so on. So like that is something that teachers can actively engage in with their students, and that's good for media literacy and society and all that. But really, that's just great instruction.
Right.
I would add, I'm not sure that I could attribute this directly to the teacher's intent of trying to sort of surface bias in the content for their students, but I have seen teachers do something that I think is effective to that end. Whether they did it intentionally for that purpose, I'm not sure, but it's fairly simple, but it's just slow down the pace of reading and of content consumption. One of the things that I perceived you did when you looked at that graphic was to sort of look twice or look a third time, and I think that graphic was probably designed to get you to look once, or it caught your eye, and that may have been its primary purpose. But you took more time to form an opinion about it that was informed by further reading of the article or a closer look at the map, or you contrasted it with other maps, or what other background knowledge you had on that area of the world, and on what you knew about climate change. And I think that the part of the dynamic of the world that we're living in right now is that it's sort of ubiquitous and instantaneous access to information, which creates, I think, this sort of soundbite culture and the micro consumption patterns that we all have, or that we're susceptible to. And it's a teacher's sort of privilege to have a full class period with their students and be in a position to direct their attention and also to direct their pace. And when I've seen teachers do that, it leads to a richer, more thoughtful discussion, which I think, as my bias, is that's what actually students really want and benefit most from. So like if the teacher's intent were simply to give them a quick look at a lot of things, that's what students already have for the most part on their devices, and as they overhear adults talking. What they don't really have is an opportunity to dive a little bit deeper. And that's not something that Newsela can cause to happen, but it can enable it.
Sure.
If the teacher wants that to happen.
Yeah, well, I mean, those are the things that we talk about with schools as well, is that depth versus breadth, that sort of slowing down and diving deep, right? And engaging kids with meaningful content and things that do interest them, and doing it in ways that helps them really think deeply about it, which is the questioning and looking at different sources and establishing a culture and a climate in which they can do that and they feel safe to do that. Matter of fact, maybe are encouraged to do that or discouraged from not doing that, right? I feel like, and I wonder how you all feel about the way that social media has played into news and if it plays any role in your work. But that echo chamber that we see, I mean, social media, Twitter is probably the worst or the best example of it, in this sort of echo chamber that news gets retweeted and tweeted, and it is that sensationalism and the confirmation and desirability bias that people are just, it seems, willing to find and consume and discard anything that will make them feed their outrage or their anger or whatever, whether it's against Trump or against Adam Schiff or who knows, right? And just discard immediately anything that is contrary to that. So is there any role that social media has in your work, or how has that affected anything that you all have done, if at all?
Well, you and Jim Bentley were tweeting back and forth to each other about Newsela. So yes, does social media play a role? Well, I mean, we communicate our articles through social media, and unsurprisingly, it's on Twitter where we'll get some of the feedback on those articles. It doesn't happen often, but it definitely occurs. And that's primarily the way we use it. But in fact, our teachers use social media like crazy to share resources with each other. They'll create text sets. I love our text sets for exactly the reason you talked about, which is diving deep on a topic. Teachers will create text sets of their own and share them out. They'll create lesson plans using Newsela content. They'll share those things out as well. So social media plays a very important role in the Newsela-verse, though we really focus our energies just on the site itself.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we definitely we're tweeting back and forth, and I'm torn, sort of schizophrenic on Twitter and social media. I feel like I should just get off of it completely, but then every so often I think, well, just asking questions. I learn so much in so many ways, and I try not to engage in Twitter wars. It's really, really difficult. I would imagine that when you get vitriol from people on Twitter, the danger is, of course, that it can be a runaway mob and just be a huge problem, for a company, a public relations nightmare. But that's a whole other topic. What is the process, and how do you take a source and then make it reader or age level or the reading level appropriate? How does that work?
So the basic idea is it's sort of a combination of software and human intelligence. When we've looked at people might want to hear us say it's done by AI and robots and lasers, but we've seen, for the most part, the kind of context sensitivity that's required to translate, and I think of it as a translation from a higher level, more complex text down to a lower level. It's ways that are similar to translating from one language to another. It requires a human intelligence and sensitivity that when we started out, we really found that editors have. Like our chief content officer comes out of the news business, and I think that the sensitivity that a human can bring to translating an article to a lower reading level without losing the story and maintaining the students' and the readers' engagement with the content, that's sort of the magic that the human brings. The software can give the writer a feedback loop that lets them check their work against the complexity of what they've started with and the complexity of what they're achieving when they take it down from a 12th grade level to a 10th, to an 8th, to a 6th, to a 4th. So it's a hybrid. It's a combination with a sort of software with a great deal of human oversight.
Well, that's got to be pretty labor intensive. And how many articles do you do? Is it daily or weekly, or what's the sort of schedule?
Yeah, so we publish on weekdays, and we're publishing currently 10 articles a day. So it is labor intensive to some extent. It's funny when you said that. I was thinking back to when we were first going around, sort of pitching Newsela to teachers and saying, "Would you use a service that did this?" We had teachers saying, "Oh, you guys level articles too?" Because they were spending Sunday nights finding articles and leveling them. And so there's a labor that labor of love that they were trying to make this content accessible. And we found ways to make it very efficient. And we have writers who are particularly good and specialize, just the way you find like translators who know a certain author's voice. We have writers who understand domains and particular content very well and can do it efficiently.
Yeah, and it's not just levels and every text at 5 different reading levels. It may be one of the things we're best known for, but every article has multiple assessments attached to it, and that's also done with that mixture of human and machine intelligence with a lot of human labor involved. But the secret. One of the secret sauces to Newsela is curation, that teachers spend an extraordinary amount of time hunting on the internet, this jungle known as a Google search for materials that work for them. And as they're macheting their way through that jungle, they have to encounter dangers like, is this appropriate for my students? Is this a truthful source? Is it a quality source? Is the writing good? Is it accessible to my students? And how will I know whether they've read it and understood it? And teachers spend an extraordinary amount of time just searching and then cobbling together these materials, as well as making them accessible and accessible in their classrooms. And we've essentially realize economies of scale in doing that. We do that on behalf of the teachers in a huge variety of ways through the thousands and thousands of text sets that we have, through collections to provide entire units of study, custom collections that we create for school districts, enabling smart recommendations of content for both teachers and students. So if you read article, you might also be interested in this article. And that ends up saving teachers a lot of time. So yeah, it's labor intensive on our end, but in the grand scheme of things, of all the labor involved in education, I think we're actually reducing it.
Yeah. Well, it is an arduous task. I remember I was in the classroom for 15 years and trying to find articles, especially pre-internet. Boy, I suppose actually in some ways it's easier, but it's harder with the internet because there's more out there perhaps, but it's you've got to wade through those other things that you mentioned. So I'm looking at the site here and I see, so like government and economics is a, I guess, topic, an area in which teachers can click. So take me through, if you could, the process of, like, let's look at the tariffs and the China trade war. I see that's a piece here. The tariff game, how the U.S.-China trade war got to this point. And there's another one, understanding the China model, key to trade dispute with the U.S. If you're assuming you remember or you were involved in it. I don't know how much you're involved with specific things, but I mean that is a topic that could easily be spun one way or the other. So this is I click on this one. It's from Bloomberg, and how do you approach something like that?
If a topic is top of mind in America, or it's something that's been frequently requested by teachers and students, a topic or a subject, or some historical figure that they're interested in, we'll try to be responsive to that. And then we'll search from the hundreds of sources that we have available to us to find articles that would be most illuminating, most interesting to kids, and avoids the sensationalism. Funny enough, you picked that Bloomberg article. Bloomberg probably the readers who read that article are trying to figure out, how do I navigate what's going on between the U.S. and China in order to make the most money?
Right.
So they want it to be as accurate and factual as possible, because their bottom line doesn't benefit from sensationalism. But that's just one instance, and I think it's a pretty good and I do think it's a pretty good example of how we apply our particular lens to content selection to tackle these tough topics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the impeachment inquiry, boy, that one's a little loaded, right? So that's Washington Post. Yeah.
But virtually every household is going to be talking about it, and so we're going to continue to provide. I created my own tech set called Impeach, and so that students can get, like, they keep on hearing this word.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody asked my 13-year-old yesterday, so do you know? So this impeachment is going on. Do you know what that's all about? And I said, yeah, like they're trying to fire the president, and I was like, well, that's not exactly what an impeachment is. So here's my guy, deep in a household led by his dad as Newsela's leader, and talking about news all the time, and he's not exposed to some of the most basic concepts around the workings of this important part of government.
Right.
And so that's the main thing we want students to understand, like, what are all the issues at play and how does everything work? Because, like, until you know what an impeachment is all about, and probably a lot of Americans haven't fully absorbed what happens after an impeachment, for example. The news has spent a lot of time educating the public on that, because it's something that's relatively new for most Americans. And that's what we're going to try to do as well with impeachment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm curious if you don't mind sharing, assuming you have some routines and personal habits, and I'll go first. So when I think about one of my morning routines is, I get some coffee and I start looking through news, and I look at local stuff, but then looking at Twitter and Facebook that give me some interesting things. Usually Twitter has some topical, late breaking or, recent news-ish kinds of things. Certainly lets me know what people are, at least in the Twitter sphere, are most concerned about. I go to the New York Times and I poke through there. I go to the Wall Street Journal. I poke through there. I tend to find, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Bulwark, which is a conservative outlet that is interesting in that I think it does a good job of, from a conservative perspective, looking at how Trump operates or doesn't operate, or complaints and concerns about everything Trump. And then looking at Spectrum, which is the one that I mentioned before, which has right-leaning, left-leaning, and I find it interesting. I actually often don't click on anything there. I just look at the headlines, and it's interesting for me to see the right-leaning and left-leaning in the way that it's being spun, and figure, well, it's probably somewhere in the middle there. If I see something that I would clearly identify as being pretty sensational, I sort of chuckle and don't click on it explicitly. And Breitbart or something like that, I just don't feel like that's probably going to be anything other than a really highly spun piece. So that's my typical morning routine to try to get a balanced approach. Is there something that you all do that is similar?
I would love to answer. Unfortunately, it's 1 o'clock. It's 1 o'clock.
Oh yeah. I'm sorry.
And forgive me, but I do have to run as I have another call.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
But I'd be happy to, just in terms of answering that question, I'd be happy to speak to our chief content officer about sort of their routine as they go about looking at these issues.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I totally lost track of time there. And I don't know if Dan, can you wrap us up here, or do you need to jump off of this line as well?
I also need to go, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, we'll put the links that we mentioned in the show notes and make sure that we have all of the social media things. And if you all want to share those things with me, that would be great. Appreciate the time and the conversation, and thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
All right.
Thanks, Drew.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, TeachThought.com and WeGrowTeachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.